In this war between humans and werewolves, the missing people reappeared, that they were no longer themselves, they had become werewolves. Chapter 11, discussing a mutual hatred. Well, how far back do you want me to go? Kade mused, eyes trained on the road. I thought for a moment before responding. I already know the basics. I mean, I was so young when it happened, but my mother's told me a bit. There was a war. The wolves obviously won, etc. I don't know anything more than that. That is the basics of it. Kade started, eyes trained on the road. How old were you when it happened? About 10. Old enough. I paused, seizing the chance to ask him to elaborate. What was it like? His hands tightened and released the steering wheel a couple more times before responding. When he did, all trace of humor was gone. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It was nothing. People just kept disappearing. The news told us it was terrorists, drug lords, stuff like that. Then, the people who disappeared started showing up again. Only, they weren't themselves anymore. They were werewolves. Glancing out the window, the one and only. Once that happened, no one could deny their existence. Then, the story changed to peace. The government had found a new way to live longer or some shit like that. But, people kept on disappearing, including higher-ups. Before long, more than half of every country's government was gone. Companies were falling, supplies were limited, and most everything went under. They told us it was fine, but we knew it wasn't. Small fights broke out here and there, but people were mostly just scared and starting to panic. We knew something was coming. Before long, at least everybody had lost some member of their family, if not multiple. That's when we finally realized it. They were building themselves up, building an army, so to speak, trying to outnumber us. At that point, we tried to fight back, but by then it was too late. I let out a small breath, thinking of my family during that time. I didn't remember anything, so I drew my own conclusions. My mother never talked about him, but I knew by common sense that at one point it had a father. I didn't like to think of him often, for fear of what his story might be. There wasn't much of a chance he was human anymore, or alive. Kade's words only added to those suspicions. That's when the war started, isn't it? Focusing back on the big picture, he nodded. They almost outnumbered us by the time we saw what was actually happening. We didn't stand a chance. But why? Why did they do it? Why does any predator attack? To get stronger? To get control? If you ask me, they're just waiting until they can change or kill us all. Humans are weak compared to them. They need to be killed off. It's just a matter of time before we start fighting and surrender. I shuddered at his last sentence, hugging my body close. Are they all like that? He thought for a moment. Have you met one that isn't? I thought about Samuel. He didn't seem overly dangerous, but I was still scared of him and what he could do. He controlled me, yelled at me, followed me, insulted me, told me I was his. I alluded to the fact that if it were up to him, I wouldn't be human much longer. He never physically hurt me, but the threat was always there. Kade took my silence as an answer. They're ruthless and savage animals. Samantha, they take what they want and they don't want humans. We managed to get rid of a lot of them, but they always make more. I nodded. So how did we start fighting against them? That's a bit of a happier story. Kade smiled. One that isn't even finished. No, I questioned. Definitely not. We haven't won, yet. I smiled at his faith and enthusiasm. Up until this point, I'd only thought about getting out of town so my family and I could be free. It never really went beyond that. Even though I knew the war was raging and destroying other towns and countries, it's hard to think of what you can do to resist when you're already defeated. In the beginning, after the initial formal attacks, people started banding together. I don't know all the details. No one really does unless you were there. But leaders rose up. We found their weakness, We exploited it. Those groups slowly spread and we've now got a resistance almost everywhere. It's taken time, but as they used to say, Rome wasn't built in a day. I mulled over his explanation. It was vague, but like he said, it was an ongoing story. So it's their weakness. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He snorted. You don't know. My eyes narrowed. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I didn't know. The only werewolf they'd ever been in indirect contact with, up until 2 weeks ago, was James. He didn't exactly spell out how to kill him. No, I stated firmly. I'm not exactly an expert in the supernatural. I'm not either, but I know how to kill a werewolf. He taunted. I let out an abrupt sigh, not sure whether or not to argue with him. You would not think that he'd be as childlike as he was at his age. And it was throwing me off. He was several years older than me, but acted the opposite. In the end, it was hard to be truly upset with his boyish demeanor. I haven't had a lot of contact with them. My family is exiled. Well, my stepfather is exiled. We kind of have to pay that price. Kade nodded again. The movement bigger than necessary. Well, I guess that's acceptable. He laughed. They really only have 2 big weaknesses. Everything else kind of falls under the 2 main ones. I waited in anticipation as he continued. Elaborate plans for attacks and poisons raced through my mind, trying to guess what exactly would work. It had to be complex and strong if it were to do any damage to their seemingly invincible bodies. One is silver, he stated matter-of-factly. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Yep, he popped the word. I know what you're thinking. But it turns out the old wives' tale is true. Anything silver will hurt them. We don't really know why, but we don't need to for it to be effective. I paused, bringing my knees up to my chest. It made sense. They got rid of money, took over all the companies, and controlled everything. It'd be easy for them to get rid of it, or at least control whoever produced it. Okay, what's the other one? I questioned lightly. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I choked on my spit, sending my body into a coughing attack. Kade slowed the car, but I signaled I was fine. He looked at me anxiously as I tried to regain my composure. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Why? I finally choked out. He raised an eyebrow. Well, they're kind of a werewolf's entire existence. You have to know about them. You know about them, don't you? Yo, I know about fucking mates. I practically growled. He leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. That was a pretty strong response. I ignored him and looked out the window once more. Again, his answer made sense, but that didn't mean I had to like or agree with it. If that statement were true, it meant Samuel would be going out of his mind to find me. That made my chances of escape extremely slim. Buildings were slowly disappearing, being replaced with bright green trees. I noticed the road becoming rougher, the pavement coming to an end. The car slowed to meet the new gravel, careful not to knock the contents of the truck around. I was suddenly aware of how far out of town we were. I tried to look through and glanced behind us, watching for anything that might be following. Kade suddenly laughed. I turned to glare at him, but his face was alight with knowledge. You're running from a mate, he exclaimed, wiggling his finger in my direction. You know, it's a good thing Margaret didn't know about that. She'd have lost her shit. I am not, I started to protest. However, he caught me in his gaze and I knew there was no point in denying it. So what if I am? He chuckled. There's no doubt he'll go batshit crazy. I almost feel sorry for that bastard. He paused and looked up for a moment, pouting his lip. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, Heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. Looking down to the ground, it was nice to openly talk about a mutual hatred. So who is it? We're not that close. Do you love him? I turned to him, wide-eyed. Obviously not. Do you see him here with me? No. Well, that's because he is an awful. I struggled to find the right words. He is an awful. Controlling. Stupid. Motherfoo. He raised his palms in surrender. Okay. I get the point. I mean, granted, he doesn't sound that different from the rest of them, so it's not a hard picture to get. How far it out? Very much wanting to change the conversation, Kade looked at the dashboard and then at our surroundings. It's say 10 minutes until we reach the border. From there, it'll be another 2 hours until we drop you off. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. Everything was so big. The next 10 minutes passed in silence. Each of us caught in our own thoughts. I was sure Kade was trying to figure out who my mate was, and I was busy making sure not to let him come anywhere close to knowing. No one ever could. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Margaret told you the plan, right? Kade suddenly questioned. I realized the cars were slowing to a stop. Gates suddenly popping up all around us. They were tall and wired with spikes lining the tops. Every few feet guards walked and paced, watching each foreign movement with inhuman eyes. Don't talk. Don't move. Don't breathe. I repeated her words. Kade smiled, but didn't respond. He rolled down his window, putting the car forward a couple inches. His smile started to fade as a large older man walked to the car. His hair was clipped short, grey hairs mixing in with the blonde, though his face betrayed his age. Apart from that, you would have thought he was in his prime. His shoulders were large and broad, arms flexing underneath the black shirt he wore. A scowl was lining his features, only enhancing his menacing demeanor. Kade and I both lowered our gazes when he came to the window. State your case. He spoke loudly, delivering supplies to the blue-eyed pack. Sir, Kade spoke monotonously. The man looked at Kade, around the truck, and then to me. He motioned for another man to look into the bed of the truck as he continued speaking. Let's see some identification. Kade slowly pulled his hand to his jeans pocket, pulling out 2 small sheets of paper. The man studied them carefully, his gaze occasionally glancing up to me. Chess knew. My heart fluttered. Chess the new apprentice. Sir, Kade stated. He hesitated when the guard stood still. I apologize. It's her first delivery. We thought you were aware. I marveled at how he kept his even tone and spoke only the truth. Technically, I was an apprentice for them, and this was my first time out of town. They didn't have to know the rest of the story to believe his words. The man turned to me, looking me up and down. I was uncomfortable under his gaze. But again, I didn't move. I didn't think I could. Every scenario of this situation going wrong was on repeat in my mind. And every scenario ended with Samuel killing me. With each passing moment, my chest grew tighter until I felt as if my skin was going to split under the pressure. My eyes darted between our open window and the surrounding area, ready to run if needed. I knew I wouldn't get far, but I wasn't going back without a fight. It was in that moment that I decided I'd rather die than face home again. The man backed away from the car for a moment, gesturing for someone else to take a look at our papers. I saw Kade tense slightly, but he said nothing. By this time Margaret's car had already slipped through the gate, and they were waiting for us on the other side. Painful minutes passed, and Kade snuck a glance at me. He smiled slightly, trying to reassure my shaking body. However, his reassurances did nothing. I knew we were dead. Eventually, the guard examining the truck supplies came forward and made a signal. The blonde-haired man came back to our window, grunted again, letting his gaze on me linger. Almost begrudgingly, he sighed and handed us our sheets of paper. With a final movement, he waved his hand and backed away. We slowly drove forward again, inching until we met the other white truck. Once the gates were closed behind us, we set off down the road. We drove for several minutes before I let out a large and shaky breath. I glanced behind us and dared a smile when I saw no one following. Kade looked at me and laughed slyly. Though I noticed his knuckles were white against the steering wheel, he suddenly released one of his death grips and threw his arm upwards. Fist clenched. He then brought it slowly back down to his side. Mocking a cheer, he repeated this motion several times until he was practically bouncing in his chair. I laughed at his crazy actions, my mood lightening instantly. "Well, Samantha, I'd like to officially welcome you to your freedom. Tell me, how does it feel?" I mimicked his toothy grin. "Why, thank you. It truly is an honor." I stared at our surroundings. They hadn't changed, but I felt as if I were in an entirely new world. "It feels freeing." He laughed at my bad joke and I followed suit. I took a moment to again look out the window, hardly letting myself believe what happened. We actually made it. "So what happens to you after this?" I suddenly questioned. He thought for a moment. "Nothing. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Nilbe, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I go back to town, keep living my life and fighting where I can. I doubt that once they know you're gone we'll be able to sneak someone out like this again. What with your mate freaking out and all. Is he high-ranking?" I ignored his question, too afraid they'd take me back if they knew the answer. "Are you guys going to be okay?" I countered, a tinge of guilt starting to stab at my stomach. If Samuel knew that they had helped me escape, they'd face worse than death. I suddenly realized it was only mine and my family's lives at stake. But there's two. They'd all risked everything. "Oh, don't worry about us. We'll be fine. They'd have to catch us first." I rolled my eyes. "'Course that'd be really hard." He ignored my taunt and smiled. A thought suddenly came to me, and I couldn't help but voice it. "Kade, I know I shouldn't be asking this, but can you do me a favor?" His eyebrows raised. "What is it?" "I just don't have anyone to look after my mom or brother once I'm gone. Can you just keep an eye on them? I can give you their names." He nodded in understanding. "Sure, I can do that. Thank you. Thank you for everything. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I know you guys are putting your asses on the line for me, and I'm not sure why, but I'm grateful. You're welcome," he said uncomfortably. "We're just trying to help everyone we can. We're in this together. We know it's at stake. Maybe you can pay us back someday." I nodded. They weren't naive in the affairs of the world. They welcomed the war and fought in it, standing up for what they believed in. I envied their courage. "It's a pretty long drive from here. You should probably get some sleep. Who knows when you'll get it again." I thought about his words but realized he was right. My eyes closed and I doubted did sleep, but before long I was slipping into unconsciousness. Chapter 12. Into the woods I awoke to trees. Never-ending masses of vibrant green spotted with shades of wood. It would have been a beautiful sight, but the sun was well into its descent. Shadows were airlessly dancing across the gravel, attempting to swallow the trucks who dared to invade their space. It was suffocating. I took in my surroundings, waking from my light sleep, and looked over to Kade. His body was relaxed and his face neutral, but I could tell he was deep in thought. He noticed my stirring and glanced over at me, smiling quickly. "I was just about to wake you up. We're not too far from the drop-off." I stretched my limbs, preparing them for the walking they were about to do. It was then I noticed the backpack at my feet, filled with my own supplies and their payment. I almost forgot. I told him, rummaging through the bag. He watched my movements from the corner of his eye as he kept one hand on the steering wheel. I pulled out the grocery sack Remy had given me, removing 2 or 3 items from the bag for myself. I put the few things back in my backpack and held out the rest for Kade. "What's that?" I hesitated. "A payment." Understanding light up his face. Oh, that's right. You can give it to Margaret. But, he drew out the last word. I noticed the car slowing down as he stopped it momentarily. When we were at a standstill, he reached for the sack. He took out several more items and stuffed them into my backpack before giving me a small smirk. You need more than an hour's worth of food and water. But, that leaves you with hardly anything, I protested. He let out a short laugh. We're not the ones running through the woods for a couple of days. I think we'll be all right. His gaze lingered on mine, carefully watching my eyes. I looked again to the backpack. Comparing it to the volume of the plastic sack, Kade had given me almost all the supplies. I pointedly stared at it, not quite sure what to do. I really can manage with less. I disagreed. Kade broke his gaze and rolled his eyes, putting the car forward once again. Trust me, you really can't. Well then, thank you. I huffed out a breath, trying to hide my excitement. The extra supplies really would help. I might stand a chance now. It told myself I'd find food and water along the way, but I knew the slim chances of that actually happening. Now I didn't have to worry and could focus solely on running. Are we almost there? Just a bit further, he told me before hesitating. So, what's your plan? My plan? You're like, how are you going to make it all the way up north? I paused. I hadn't thought it'd actually make it this far. By walking, I guess. Kade laughed once. Do you know the direction? North. I questioned. He looked at me. Worried now? Lines crinkled their way into the corners of his eyes along with a solid one filling his forehead. Samantha, do you know anything past this point? I let out a long breath of air and thought carefully. I have enough supplies to make it to the varying safe houses. Gil asked directions at each one. I guess. I brought some warmer clothes for the nights and I'll find shelter in between the houses. What about your scent? I paused, my face paling. I hadn't thought of that. I stuttered, trying to figure out how I could fool a wolf's most powerful tool, especially one that probably had my scent memorized. Kade saw my white face and only laughed at my unease, placing one of his hands lightly upon my own. You're killing me. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Not removing his hand. There's not a lot you can do for your scent, apart from try and get laid. Just stay up, Woodin. Don't worry about that too much. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It'd be hard for anyone to follow you out here. All you probably smell like is this truck and me. The car suddenly stopped. I looked up for my conversation, noticing we weren't in an area that looked particularly different from anywhere else. The trees still looped over the road, and now that we were stopped it felt as if they'd succeeded in swallowing us. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Kade said as he put the car in park. He proceeded to slip off his jacket, his shirt rising slightly with the action. Ignoring this, he handed me the dark material. Wear this. It'll confuse the scent a bit more if anyone manages to get this far. I took the jacket. Gratefully, I wish I had something to give you in return. Don't worry about it. Like I said, you can pay us back someday. Well counted as a favor. I smiled warmly in his direction. Through the fading light, it was getting harder to read his expressions. However, his smile was still curled around his face, crinkling his eyes. He held my gaze for a moment too long, and I watched his expression falter slightly. His eyes got serious, pleading even, and he opened his mouth to say something. However, he was quickly interrupted. Kade, Margaret was suddenly at our window. I jumped at the sudden appearance but quickly started gathering my things. Kade swiftly exited the car, leaving me to finish my preparations. I made sure my backpack was secure before slipping his jacket over my head. I lingered in the truck for just a moment, preparing myself to enter the wilderness. I never was one to leave the forest, considering all the dangers it held. Now it'd be living in it for days on end. I quietly jumped from the truck and walked around to the front to meet them. By the time I got there, they were whispering harshly to each other. I tried to catch a word of what they were saying, but they fell silent at my appearance. I coughed uncomfortably, suddenly very ready to get out of here. "Here's the payment," I told Margaret, handing her the small sack. She didn't so much as glance at it before tossing it into the bed of the truck. I watched her stiff movements, wondering what could have her so worked up. Flashbacks of mine and Kade's conversation in the car came to mind. But I was sure Kade would know what I was running from. He'd been looking out for me, helping me. He wouldn't stop now. "Thank you so much for everything," I told them both, attempting to break an awkward silence. "It's nothing," Kade told me. "There should be safe houses up the way several miles. I suggest you don't stop until you get there." Margaret spoke for the first time. I nodded my head in response while slipping my back onto my shoulders. The weight gave me a newfound excitement and determination. After adjusting the straps, I looked at them both. I caught them in the middle of exchanging firm glances with one another, silent communication raying through their faces. I could feel something off, but I quickly brushed it away. It'd be gone in a matter of moments and would have to worry about them. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "Samantha," Margaret sighed, "just don't get killed." "Well, no, if you make it." She abruptly left and stalked towards her car, slipping into the passenger seat with ease. "Well, I believe that's your cue." Kade laughed. I nodded, smirking. "I believe it is." I opened my mouth to say goodbye, but before I could I was enveloped in Kade's arms. My body froze involuntarily, and he either didn't notice or care. After a few moments, I felt my arms wrapping around his waist. I didn't know what I was doing, or why he was hugging me for so long, but I did have to admit it felt nice. "Be careful. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." He spoke softly into my hair without breaking the embrace. I started to pull away, but he held me closer. "Kade," I protested, suddenly claustrophobic. "Just a second longer. You'll smell like me." I could only nod. I knew he had good intentions, but the captivity of his arms only brought back painful memories. My arms held him for a bit longer as I endured the embrace until I couldn't stand it anymore. Slowly, I peeled my arms back and he did the same, though somewhat reluctantly. He laughed when I noticed this, pushing it quickly to the side. I retreated from his tall frame, my footsteps crinkling in the leaves and sticks beneath me. "I'll see you later." "Thank you." Again, he smiled and waved as I turned my back, heading for the line of trees. My heart started pounding harder in my chest the closer I drew. Now that I was directly underneath them, I realized how vast they were. Each tree was a different shape, size, and type, but they were all the sizes of small buildings. I wanted to hesitate, to turn back, but I knew Kade was watching. For some reason this gave me the confidence I needed to move forward. Pushing through the first line of brush, I let Kade's jacket fall past my hands, the material shielding my skin from the protruding branches and thorns. I kept walking forward until I could no longer see the light from the cars. At this point, I finally turned around, panting slightly. Like it thought, I was fully enveloped in the forest. The bright greens of the trees were dying down with the light, replacing the once vibrant color with a monotonous black. I realized that with the trees, the ground had also turned dark. The various uprooted timber and fallen branches were hidden to my view as I blindly stumbled forwards. I gripped trunks as I walked by them, steadying myself as I tripped with each step. After several painful minutes of staggering through the forest, I stopped again. I knew that at this rate, it'd take me years to get anywhere. This was going to be a long night. Chapter 13, the safe house. It had to be beyond the next horizon. That's what I kept telling myself as my feet propelled me forward, continuing to push as far as I could see. It was easier to see now. considering the darkest part of the night had passed and rays of the sun were slowly beginning to rise. My path no longer was dark and malicious, scattered with varying things I could trip over, but illuminated in the soft glow of the morning sun. I expected the morning to give me renewed energy, or at the very least a newfound sense of direction. However, it gave me nothing but light. I was beyond grateful I could now see, but everything else was beginning to wear. My body ached, my lungs begged for air, my feet were numb, and my broken wrist was throbbing in time with my heart. I desperately wanted to stop and give my body a rest, but I wouldn't allow it, not until I found the safe house. So I trudged on. I tried to ignore the protests from each of my limbs and distract myself with thoughts of freedom and what it would be like outside the country. The war would be raging, but that meant there would be towns where the wolves weren't in charge. I'd find one of those towns. I'd find a place to live, people I could trust. I'd enlist the help of others to go back and rescue my mother and Will. We'd all live together, free from the reign of those who thought they were above us. I smiled to myself at the daydream, letting that hope propel me forward. The thing that excited me most was that it was just a daydream anymore. It was becoming a reality. All I had to do was keep moving, I would make it come true. My smile widened as I suddenly realized that I had the power to do anything I wanted. There was no longer anyone forcing me to behave a certain way because of who I was perceived to be. It was mid-morning now, and nothing around me had changed. Not the scenery, not my aching body, but not my determination. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylen Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. By this point, I was once again in desperate need of food and water. I paused momentarily, ducking behind a particularly thick tree. I leaned on the trunk, giving myself a moment of relief, as I dug through my backpack. I'd been careful with my supplies, so there were still quite a few things to pick from. In the end, I grabbed a bottle of water and can of diced chicken. I would need the protein to keep my body moving. Once I had the items in my hands, I packed up and began moving again. If I stayed leaning against that tree any longer, I was afraid I wouldn't get back up. So I continued on, but this time with the companionship of the chicken. The sun was directly above my head now, and I began shedding my various layers. Kade's jacket was the first to go, followed by my own that had slipped on halfway through the night. They each went into my bag as I was sure I'd need them again later. I was debating taking off my extra pair of socks when I came upon a small clearing. I stopped in my tracks as I noticed the trees thinning to reveal a small white stone building. I stared at the building in shock. Was I imagining it? I began to move forward again, but movement inside the building sent me to the ground. I crouched in place, making sure I was concealed by the brush. As I sat on the ground, I listened to a foreign voice. It came from inside the house, and I was only able to hear the sound because of a window that stood ajar. The voice was deep, however, so I deemed it to belong to a man. I concentrated harder as I tried to pick out what the voice was saying. However, I soon realized I didn't have the hearing of a werewolf. I sighed before adjusting my weight to lift myself slowly up. My eyes scanned the house. Falling on the window I heard the noise coming from. I watched one figure pace back and forth, passing the window every few seconds. His frame was tense and I noticed his hands were balled into fists, swinging by his side in time with his stride. He was the only one I saw for a few moments until a smaller figure sat at the window. I saw long dirty blonde hair falling behind the figure's shoulders, falling limply against the back. This one was silent, but I figured it was a woman. All of my senses were now focused on that small house and the two people inside. The house was sitting in the center of the clearing, the nearest tree several yards away. It had nothing and almost seemed to beckon me inside. However, my feet wouldn't move. Though I knew this was obviously a safe house, I wasn't intent on barreling inside until I knew I could trust whoever was there. I was ripped out of my intense stare, but I heard something cracking behind me. I whipped my head around only to come face to face with a man. He had light brown hair and a tall frame, long arms wrapping something close to his body. When his gaze landed upon me, he let his arms fall, and I watched as he dropped the various small sticks and chunks of wood that he'd been holding. The wood clattered against each other as it all fell to the ground, sending the noise ringing through the silent trees. I jumped up from my spot and prepared myself to run, but the man quickly put himself in front of me. "Samantha," he breathed, almost in disbelief. I furrowed my eyebrows. "Who are you?" My voice was hoarse, but it came out strong and demanding. "I'm Zane." He moved a foot forward, but I quickly flinched back. "I'm not going to hurt you. How do you know my name?" "Margaret told us you would be coming through here." He spoke slowly, watching me carefully. His words registered in my mind and I instantly relaxed. He noticed this and gave a weak smile. "Why don't we head inside? We've been waiting for you." I looked back warily at the house but reluctantly nodded. If Zane was with Margaret, I could trust him. Zane started moving, gesturing for me to follow. He walked slowly out of the brush and towards the cement building, whistling loudly as we approached. The man and woman inside immediately looked out the window, their gazes landing on me. I tried to look tall and strong, but my weakened body only came across as tired and dead. The woman disappeared from the view of the window and came out the side of the building, running towards Zane and I. I stopped in my tracks, watching as she approached me. When she noticed I had stopped, she put her hands up much like Zane had done earlier. "Kade, Zane's sister. Can I help you inside?" Her voice was sweet and welcoming. I didn't notice it at first, but she began walking forward again and reached for my bag. All at once, I relaxed. I let her take my backpack and watched as she slid it over her shoulder before putting her arm underneath mine. She started walking forward, taking my weight with her. I leaned on her fully, grateful for the help. The three of us walked to the side of the building and through a small wooden door. Once inside, the other man looked me over while walking quickly to Zane. I watched him carefully, though not as warily as before. He was taller than Zane, but not much broader. His skin reminded me of chocolate, but his eyes were golden, seeming to pierce through my exterior. If he had hair, it was clipped short enough so that it would not be seen. He nodded slightly in my direction to Zane, whispering something. I tried to catch what he was saying, but before I could listen in, Kade was speaking to me. "The house doesn't have any furniture." She gestured to the barren one-roomed home. "So you'll just have to settle for the ground." She led me to a corner of the room, helping me slide lightly against the stone walls. Now, with a full view of the room, I noticed how small it was. It could hardly be called a safe house, as it was more of a single bedroom with a smaller room in the back. No bathroom. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Kade started. "You just have to go outside. It's not glamorous, but it'll do." She laughed. "Talia put my backpack down next to my feet before sitting next to me." I smiled lightly at her, though my gaze followed the two men who retreated into the back room. She noticed my gaze and laughed lightly. "Enzo was a bit on edge. I'm sure he just wants to make sure you're who you say you are." She spoke lightly. I nodded in response, leaning my head against the wall. This was the first time I'd sat down since yesterday, and my body was grateful for the relief. Talia suddenly chuckled. "You know, we didn't really expect you until tonight or tomorrow. You must have been hauling us." I smiled at her again, taking a bit of pride at my hard work. It had paid off. I didn't really stop. "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I shifted my weight to look outside the window and the sun overhead. "I don't think you'll be staying too long here." "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Kada's eyes widened. I now noticed her baby-like features, morphing her face into a sweet and innocent expression. The more I looked at her, the more I saw the resemblance between her and Zane. "Seriously. But you've got to be exhausted." I closed my eyes for a moment. "I am. But I have to keep moving. At least stay for a few hours." We got some wood to start a fire tonight, so it will be warm inside. Take a rest and eat a real meal. Your body will thank you for it. She's right. You know. Zane's voice met my ears. I opened my eyes to watch the two men come out of the back room. They looked at Kade and I, Zane folding his arms across his chest. I started to protest, but he held up his hand. Just rest for a little bit and see how you feel. If you still want to go. But, trust me, you need the rest. I slowly nodded, taking the three of them in. I shifted my body weight, suddenly slightly uncomfortable. My mind told me they were only helping, but my heart didn't like the fact they were trying to keep me here. Zane noticed my sudden unease and raised his arms. Look, you do you. We're not forcing you to stay, but you should know you won't make it much further without a proper rest. I slowly nodded. He was right. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And we all knew it. He smiled and walked to the opposite end of the room, gesturing to the other man while he did so. This is Enzo. By the way. I smiled in his direction, and he nodded at me. Good to have you. Sorry about earlier. We never can be too careful. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I understand. The two men sit down across from each other, and now each of us was leaning against a wall. It made the house seem even smaller. I closed my eyes again, trying to calm my nerves. These people were here to help. They were humans. The good guys. There was no reason I should be afraid of them. Chapter 14 Sunset. I awoke what felt like not much longer, but when I looked outside I realized I had fallen asleep for a few hours. The sun well into its descent, leaving shadows in its wake. When I saw this, I jolted upright and looked around. Zane and Kade were in the middle of the room, organizing wood around a roaring fire. At my sudden movement, they both glanced in my direction. Zane spoke up. Glad to see you're awake. Enzo is skinning some rabbits right now. When HE's done and Kade cooks it, we'll have some food. I looked at the pair in front of me. They were clearly at ease, their backs to me and to the door. It set me at ease as well, knowing they weren't afraid. Thanks. My mind still recovering from sleep. How are you feeling? Kade asked. Better. I needed sleep. You were right. She's always right. Zane taunted. Talia shot him a glance. I am, and you better not forget that. The two laughed. A pain suddenly shot through my heart as I remembered my own family, especially Will. My mind threatened to take me to the possibilities of his fate alone with James, but I was pulled from my thoughts as the door suddenly opened, revealing Enzo. He carried two rabbits, though you could hardly tell if that's what they were anymore. All the skin was ripped away, revealing only the muscle and tissues underneath. His bloodied hands held them up proudly. Talia shot up from her position and greeted Enzo, taking the two animals by a leg. She returned to the fire and sat with her back to me once more. Enzo wiped his hands a couple times on his jeans, red streaks leaving their mark in the blue denim. He noticed me watching and smiled. Have you ever eaten wild animal? Though I'm sure came out as more of a grimace. Nope. Don't have a lot of experience with blood and guts. He laughed, a loud and booming noise. It's messy business, that's for sure. As he was speaking he came and sat next to me, though I noticed he stayed a good distance away. How are you feeling? I opened my mouth, but Zane cut me off. She said she's fine and Kade's always right. Enzo raised his eyebrow at me and I laughed. I really did need sleep. He nodded his head, bringing a knee up to rest his elbow on. You only got a few hours. You might want to think about getting more. Maybe. I mused. I thought about his proposition, glancing again to the window. The sun was dangerously low and if it wasn't for the rabbit, I knew it'd be gone already. I reached for my backpack while I thought, pulling out Kade's jacket. It was already getting cooler. How do you fare last night with the cold? Zane piped in, crawling to sit next to Enzo against the wall. Talia listened in, though she continued to focus on the rabbits. Well, I have 2 jackets and extra socks, so I did fine. I kept moving, I think that helped the most. You could be a world-class explorer. Zane laughed. Are you ever going to stop moving? Only when I get to freedom. Did you tell anyone you were leaving? Enzo suddenly asked. No, not really, I slowly answered, thinking of my mother. But I'm sure some people have figured it out. Like who? I paused. I already made the decision while walking yesterday that I was going to speak of Samuel again. He was in the past. If I kept moving, I'd stay there. My boss. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Enzo stared at me, expecting more, but Zane smiled. Have you heard of him? Yes, a good guy. Tried to petition to make the trip. It's pretty great. I paused. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Hang on. I suddenly remembered the plethora of supplies I had because of him. I've got some extra water. It's the least I can do after you guys helped me. As I talked, I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 bottles of water. Zane raised his eyebrows while Enzo furrowed his, an unreadable look appearing on his features. How much do you have? Enzo questioned. Enough, I said vaguely. Please, take them. I rolled the waters towards the 2 of them, watching the dirt and dust kick up as they went. Enzo picked his up while Zane tossed his towards Talia. Well, if you have enough supplies, I don't see why you're so bent on leaving already. Talia suddenly piped in, catching the water. I laughed lightly. I don't exactly want to get caught. If I hadn't have been looking at Enzo, I would have missed his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. I quickly added an afterthought. And the sooner I get there, the better. Once again, I think Talia is right. Zane sang. I smiled as the 2 of them exchanged mock-shocked faces. Wow, that's 2 in one day for me. You better go with my intuition. Samantha. She laughed. I continued to smile but stayed silent. Enzo was watching me now, and I couldn't measure what he was thinking or why his demeanor had suddenly changed. What are all of you doing out here? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I looked to each one of them, my gaze lingering on Enzo for a moment longer. The wolves killed our family when we were young. Margaret took us in. Talia spoke. She looked to Zane, who nodded. We've never really lived in town. Mostly just stayed in the outskirts. He finished. It suits us. I'm sorry about that. I told them, though I was slightly distracted. I looked to Enzo, awaiting his answer. The brother and sister noticed my gaze and followed it until all eyes were resting on the large man. We've all got a reason to be out here. Samantha, without waiting for a response. He quickly got up and walked to the fire. I think the rabbit's done. Talia jumped lightly, moving her hand away from the fire. After checking the meat, she nodded in Enzo's direction and gestured for the rest of us to come and grab a portion of the meal. The food was divided among us and we each sat in our own part of the room, eating quietly. Enzo's comment seemed to finalize any conversation we hoped to have. I was grateful for the silence though, as it allowed me to try and figure out the individuals before me. Zane and Talia seemed harmless enough, but Enzo was beginning to put me on edge. I had just finished my last bite of the gomai meat when Talia stood and walked to the back room. She came back holding a variety of soft material in her hands, placing them on the ground next to the fire. Listen, Samantha, she started. You can do what you want. We aren't forcing you to do anything. But we've got a fire, blankets, and a roof over your head. You should really stay here for the night. I widened my eyes at her forwardness but didn't get the time to let the shock sink in. Zane was right behind her. Not to mention, good company. The woods are lonely. gesturing to each of them. As they both spoke, unease crept into my heart. Something was settling right in my stomach. And it was the rabbit. I didn't know how rebellions, safe houses, or refuges normally worked, but I was sure it was a general principle to keep moving away from danger. If that was the case, why would they want me to stay? A small and uncomfortable silence stretched between us as the three of them awaited my answer. I glanced warily at the setting sun, which was now starting to disappear on the horizon. Trees were towering shadows once more, and the ground was already growing more and more difficult to see. This house is a good place to hide, Enzo finished. And that was it. That was what told me something was definitely wrong. Shrugging, I guess you guys are right. I think I'm going to stay for the night. I am exhausted. I yawned for good measure. Only I'm not sure I want your company. Zane. He dropped his jaw and I laughed loudly, the others following suit. Then suddenly Toya clasped her hands together. Beaming, she walked forward and grabbed one of the cotton blankets, dropping it lightly in my lap. I grinned up at her, hugging the blanket closely. Thanks, I told her. I watched the men as Tahila continued speaking, rambling on about what a great decision this was. Meanwhile, Zane and Enzo exchanged a small look. Enzo's shoulders finally relaxing. Talia noticed me looking at them, and must have noticed my unease as well. Before she could bring this to the attention of the others, I quickly pulled her in close. Can I sleep in the back room, though? I let her follow my gaze to the men in back, my eyes growing wide. She tilted her head in understanding, a warm smile crawling across her features. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. There's even a door for some privacy. A flame flickered within my chest as Toya walked back to Zane and Enzo. I quickly gathered up my things, dragging my backpack across the room. The two guys looked at me questioningly, but Toya quickly hushed any complaints they would make. I paused outside the entryway, halfway turning to them. The three were huddled by the fire, Toya clutching Zane's arm and Enzo standing with his legs apart. On the surface, they looked like anything you'd expect. But I knew better than to start looking at the surface. I smiled warmly. Thanks again. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I really needed this. Zane brought his hand up to his neck, embarrassed. Don't get all mushy, Samantha. It's only a job. Laughing lightly, I turned and walked into the small room, leaving the three of them behind forever. As my back turned to them, my expression dimmed. I quickly scanned the new dark room, my eyes immediately landing on the open window I'd seen from the outside of the house. Thought it was small. It provided a small glimmer of light, just enough to shine the way outside. Every instinct in my body told me to run right then and there. I fought desperately against the urge, knowing it would only result in the three of them chasing me. I quietly shut the door and spread the blanket across the ground. Kneeling down on it, I pulled out my other jacket and slipped it over my head. Now that I was away from the fire, I could already feel the cold setting in. I lay down on the blanket, my back to the window. My eyes were trained on the door, watching the shadows walk around in the other room. The firelight danced and flickered underneath the door, adding to the feeling of anticipation that was now rooted in my gut. I kept my eyes wide open, no sleep coming anywhere close to my consciousness. Just as it expected, I soon heard footsteps approaching my door. I quickly relaxed my body and closed my eyes, letting my hair fall over my face. I was able to peek through the strands of my eyelashes as the door cracked open, revealing a slightly distraught Toya. I pretended to awake at the sound and light, shifting and moving my hair away from my face. I smiled up at her as she wrapped her hands around the door, halfway letting herself in the room. Sorry to disturb you, but I just wanted to make sure you're all right to stay back here. It can get awfully cold. I lifted my body up to a sitting position, watching her carefully. Thanks. I just don't have great experiences with trusting men. I'm really more comfortable sleeping with a door in between me and them. Then, I looked down. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Oh no, you don't have to be sorry, she practically squealed. I can only imagine. All right, I'm going to let you sleep now. Just know you're welcome out there if you want. With that, she retreated from the doorway, leaving me in darkness once more. I let out a sigh of relief. This was an awful, crazy, and dangerous plan that had formed moments ago, but so far it seemed to be working. Play on the sympathy of Talia, Joe Quisane, appease Enzo, show of vulnerability. Then, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I laid in my position on the floor for what felt like hours, my ears strained to hear any noise coming from the other side of the door. And eventually, there was none. I first had to endure soft mumblings and a dying fire, but soon enough it seemed as if the three of them had gone to sleep. However, I waited a while longer after this happened, just to be safe. When I couldn't stand it any longer, I slowly raised myself off the ground. I rolled the blanket up and stuffed it into my backpack, muffling the zipper with my sleeves. After each movement, I paused and listened for signs of disturbance from the others. As I worked, my breathing quickened as I felt the blood rush to my head. My heartbeat was soon the only thing I could hear, and that's when I decided to slip through the window. The window was small, so I had to take it one step at a time. I carefully dropped my backpack outside the opening, letting it fall quietly on soft summer grass. I looked behind me one last time, watching now for movement. When none came, I slipped both of my legs through the ledge, my feet falling directly next to my backpack. My torso and arms followed suit as my body bent to avoid the edges. Once I was fully rooted to the ground, I ran, and I didn't stop. The only thoughts ringing through my mind were those of escape and vigilance. I couldn't go crashing through the trees, no matter how much I wanted to. I had to remain quiet, yet not allow that to inhibit my speed. I had to move in the right direction, though I didn't even know where that was. Needless to say, it was not an easy task. Soon enough, multiple leaves and twigs were snapping underneath me. I cursed at myself for not being more graceful or trained, but I didn't allow myself to stop. I kept whipping my head backward, my gaze searching for any sign of someone following me. However, it was movement behind me that made me stop. It was movement coming from straight ahead. Chapter 15 Guns. My mind didn't fully understand the noises until I saw a dark figure running straight for me. Panicked thoughts started coursing through me as it registered who it was barreling in my direction. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Without thinking, I flew over a fallen trunk and off to my right, taking myself out of his line of vision. I dared a glance behind me, and I caught Enzo just as he tripped over the hidden wood. My feet propelled me faster along the forest floor. I was no longer thinking about my movements but allowing my body to take control. Somehow, it knew what to do. Before long I heard Enzo shouting, followed by a few others. Somewhere in my mind, it registered that HED probably called for backup. That meant that soon enough I would have the other two running after me, plus whoever else was in on this ordeal. That is as if they weren't already hiding in the woods like Enzo had done. My feet continued to fly as I tried to create more distance between myself and the others. I knew they were gaining on me, but I wouldn't stop. I couldn't allow myself to be held captive by them and risk my freedom. Though these people were human, I was slowly coming to realize that the fact meant nothing. I trusted Margaret and Kade, and because of that, I had 3 people chasing me through a forest. As I ran, a path stretched out before me. I made a split-second decision and ignored it, diving to the right and further into the trees. They seemed to thicken with every footstep I made, making it harder and harder to push past the leaves and fallen limbs. I didn't let this deter me. I would outrun them or die trying. As I jumped another log, I dared a glance behind me. When I did this, though, my feet flew out from underneath me as they were snatched by a foreign object. I flailed desperately, kicking at anything I could land my foot on. My feet met the soft exterior of skin, telling my mind that it was a person who had pulled me to the ground. I opened my mouth to let out a scream, but a hand was quickly placed upon it. Both of my hands flew to rip off the muzzle, but before I could do any damage, they were pinned behind my back. I was now laying on the ground, pinned up against whoever was holding me. I continued to struggle, refusing to acknowledge the fact that it had been caught. It cowed happen, not when it come so close. Tears betrayed me as they fell rapidly from my eyes. Despite the restraint, I screamed and struggled, pulling harder against the hands holding my arms and face captive. As I fought, the person rolled our bodies to the side, settling on top of my back and shoving my face into the dirt. The weight of the body held me down, pulling the breath from my lungs. I worked harder to breathe now, my body focusing on the need for oxygen that it was finding on the ground. A voice suddenly whispered harshly into my ear, "Shut up and stay still." At the noise, my body went limp. I knew that voice. I tried to twist my head to confirm my suspicions, but a hand went to my neck, shoving my face further into the earth. The next moment, I heard countless footsteps coming closer to me. My eyes widened and I searched for a place to conceal my body before I realized I was already hidden. Thick bushels of leaves and moss surrounded mine and my assailants' bodies, protecting every part of us from view. My breathing quickened as the noises of those chasing me came closer. My mind raced with the option of letting them find me or staying with whoever held me bound. My inner battle didn't slow the world down, however, and the decision was made for me. The footsteps were upon us now, and the person on top of me sprawled across my body, knocking any remaining air from me. I half expected those chasing me to stop where I disappeared, noticing my obvious absence ahead of them. But they kept moving. They kept running in the direction it'd been going, cursing at each other as they went. Eventually, their footsteps faded and I was left only with myself, the bushes, and my new captor. The minutes went by painfully slow as we both listened for the others to come back. With each passing moment, the person on top of me slowly peeled away. It was slight at first, allowing me to only bring my face out of the mud. But when it was clear they weren't coming our way again, the person sat lightly on my legs. I stayed frozen in place as my arms were eventually released as well, too afraid to turn around. My captor didn't bother moving. "To my agent extraordinaire, Mayen Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." But eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly turned my head, though I knew what I was going to see before my eyes fell upon him. Samuel. His eyes were a bright ruby color, mixing with every emotion known to man. Each sec and held a new look, a new glare, a new demand. I stared at them. He stared straight back at me, holding me in a gaze that seemed it would never end. It seemed he was fighting something back, and I knew all too well what that something was. How I began, but was quickly cut off. The moment I opened my mouth to speak, Samuel started diminishing the distance between us. He raised his arms and twisted my body, pulling my face next to his. I was kneeling before him now, completely at his mercy, as if he knew this. He closed the remaining distance and crashed his lips upon mine. I immediately froze at his assault. My mind couldn't keep up with what was happening to my body as he moved his lips roughly against mine, demanding attention. By the time my thinking caught up, he had stopped the attack and buried his face in my neck. His arms wrapped around my torso as he pulled me even closer. My breathing stopped, my heart full. I'm pretty sure if he hadn't been holding me, I would have died right then. My mind was the only thing alive and it was screaming at me for what just happened. "I thought you were dead," he whispered into my neck. I didn't even try to respond, as too many words were racing through my mind. As if Samuel knew this, he reluctantly let me go, breathing heavily as he did so. I finally realized he no longer had me pinned up against him, and in the next moment, I was flying to my feet. He followed suit. However, enthusiasm glancing warily around us before watching me carefully. "We need to get going." He spoke louder now. I turned to face him, preparing to scream in his face. However, as soon as I looked at him, the words left my brain. Once again, he was standing before me in nothing but an old pair of shorts. He didn't have shoes, a jacket, or even a shirt. His bare chest seemed to scream. My eyes lingered there for just a moment before I raised them to his face. I expected to see rage, ferocity, and a desire to rip my heart out. However, his face was the complete opposite of my expectations. His dark eyes were back and they were almost gentle. Though the longer I stared, I could see a hint of anger bubbling beneath the surface. Quickly turning away from him, I gathered my thoughts. In not going anywhere with you, I began to sprint away from him, but he quickly grabbed my broken wrist, sending painful spasms up my arm. The day at the beach played through my mind, reminding me of how easy it was for him to prevent me from leaving him. The past few days of freedom suddenly seemed as a faraway and impossible dream. I held back a sob as my body swung back around, facing him once more. His anger wasn't beneath the surface anymore, but rising with each act of my insolence. "Do you want to get caught?" He growled at me, ruby flashing into his eyes. I looked straight at those eyes, spitting my words. "I already have." He tensed and started his retort, but he was quickly cut by a sound in the distance. "We need to go. Now." I continued to fight against him, pulling my wrist back to my body. He didn't let go, however, and only came close to me, taking the chance to grab my other arm. Before I knew what was happening, he had me thrown onto his back. I started to protest, but the sound of countless people barreling for the forest now held my attention. Samuel swore under his breath as a man suddenly appeared ahead of us. He came running toward us, a long knife shining brightly in his hand. Samuel quickly propelled us forward, easily dodging the man and his weapon. I held on tightly to his shoulders, more willing to stay with him than meet the stranger holding a knife. We flew through the forest at an inhuman speed. I closed my eyes as various leaves and bits of dirt flew into my face as we dove through bushes rather than around. Samuel's pace was rough and ragged. A loud and feral growl suddenly ripped from his chest, which sent my eyes flinging back open. Various objects were being thrown from ahead of us, and he was desperately trying to maneuver around each one while holding me steadily on his back. However, he was so lucky. Just as he ducked to the right, a short dagger came flying through the air and lodged itself in Samuel's arm. His pace faltered, allowing another identical knife to land next to the first. The injured arm fell dead to his side, half of my body following suit. Samuel stumbled in this shift of weight, his legs failing him as another knife grazed his thigh. We stumbled over each other, the weapons only digging further into his flesh as he tumbled into the dirt. When we finally stopped moving, Samuel was hovering over my body, blood pouring from his wounds. He didn't act as though he cared, though I stared in horror as the dark liquid pooled around me, seeming to glimmer against his skin. My eyes darted around us as I heard multiple people shouting, coming closer. Before I could move, at least 6 men came upon us, each holding several daggers. The weapons each varied in size and length, but they were identical in color and material. As I studied them, suddenly everything about Samuel's wounds made sense. Silver was etched into every single one. Samuel let out a loud and threatening growl as they came closer, making me follow his lead. His good arm wrapped around my side, pushing me behind him. I watched as the men continued to advance upon us. I studied each of them, quickly realizing I recognized Zane and Enzo in their midst. They were breathing heavily, eyes darting between Samuel and me. "Come any closer and you're all dead," Samuel suddenly spat. The men paused, though it didn't seem as if they were afraid of the half-human standing before them. Zane suddenly sneered. The look was so foreign compared to what I'd seen, and I took an involuntary step back. Samuel pulled me closer to him though, not allowing me to move another inch. You're outnumbered. Wolf, let's not make this harder than it has to be. Samuel scoffed. He didn't bother to respond, but his body started to shake. Bones started cracking, allowing wolf claws to suddenly appear on his hands. Just as he was about to lunge at the men and finish the shift, 2 shots rang through the air. Gunshots. He'd only heard stories of gunshots before. In the early days of James, my mother had told me about them. What they sounded like, smelled like, looked like. She had wanted me prepared if I ever came into a situation with one. Though it wasn't common, wolves had taken every single one. As I stared in the area where the shots rang off, I realized every horrible thing she said was true. 2 more figures started emerging through the trees, the small black guns held high above each of their heads. I recognized each person, each woman. The contrasting skin and hair made them look like night and day. But it was them, nonetheless. To see them together sent another wave of emotion through my body. It only confirmed what I'd been suspecting. Talia and Margaret. Another 2 shots rang through the air. And before I could register what was happening, Samuel was falling to the ground. I looked down in horror as more blood started pooling around his feet, seeping from 2 fresh wounds in each of his legs. That's enough. Margaret's voice suddenly rang out. If you move again, the next shot is going in Samantha's head. I looked up in horror as Talia slowly raised her gun to me. My arms raised up, palms facing the small crowd before us. Stop. Samuel coughed out, managing half a growl. Don't you dare fucking touch her. We won't have to if you comply. Talia spoke up. Samuel stayed silent and my eyes darted from him to the women before us. The men were still there too, each shining blade glimmering in the fading sun. Pounding seconds of silence stretched between us all as we waited on Samuel to make a move. When he stayed still, Margaret finished the ordeal. Tie them up. The men inched forward, each reaching into bags Talia threw their way. Deliberately, almost carefully, they took the rope from the duffels and advanced Samuel and I. Talia came with them, walking straight up to me. One wrong move and she's dead. She glowered at Samuel. I shrunk back at her expression, much like Zane's. It was foreign and seemed drawn against her seemingly innocent features. Samuel raised his gaze and glared back, a low noise coming from his chest. However, he stayed completely still, glancing to the gun trained on my temple. Talia stood by my side, and I mimicked Samuel's stillness, very much aware of the cold hardness pressed into my head. I didn't think I could move if I wanted to. I was still in my initial position, my feet rooted to the ground and arms raised in surrender. My eyes were the only thing that moved, following each of the men as they continued their advances. The men were next to Samuel now, and as they pushed him to his knees and started tying his hands, I noticed silver lacing through the material of the rope. As soon as I noticed this, I heard Samuel breathe, and suddenly, closing his eyes, I looked to where they bound his hands, watching the skin slowly burn. My gaze turned to one of horror as the men continued to wrap the poisonous material around Samuel's torso. Without a shirt, his skin was completely exposed. It moved around the thick rope, blisters popping up almost instantly. What are you doing? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfading enthusiasm. Desperately, I glanced to each of the people I recognized in the group. There had to be some sort of humanity in their souls, something that told them this was wrong. However, they each held stone-cold and hateful glares, their eyes trained on Samuel. I waited for them to answer me, but a sound never left their lips. Please, tell me what's going on. Margaret snapped her gaze to me as Talia shifted the gun against my head. Thane and Enza busied themselves with Samuel, never once looking my way. Samantha, you need to shut up or we will make you, Margaret voiced. My eyes widened at the threat. Confusion mixed through my brain as I watched the supposed good guys inflict pain on Samuel. Endless amounts of rope were being placed around his entire torso. His breathing was ragged now, the silver clearly taking its toll. When it seemed there wasn't an inch left of his body to cover, the men turned to me. Samuel whipped his eyes open and screamed. His voice was desperate and filled with pain. The men ignored him and roughly brought my hands forward, binding my wrists in the same rope as they had Samuel. He suddenly started thrashing beside me, and I shot a horrified glance his way when Toye shifted the gun, clicking something into place. The sound and my terrified expression were all he needed to go ghostly still. He stared in horror at a place next to my head. I desperately wanted to look there and move away from Toye, from the men, from Margaret, but I couldn't move an inch. Not without dying. Samantha, you're going to be okay. You're going to be fine. Samuel spoke in a frenzy. His voice was distressed, which did nothing to ease my fears. He knew what trouble we were in, and it was slowly dawning on me as well. I slowly nodded my head, a single tear escaping my eye. I quickly shut them as the men continued to tie my wrists, wrapping the last of the rope. When the job was done, they retreated and pulled out their weapons once more. I felt the cold barrel on my temple shift to my neck and push me forward. Move, Toye commanded. I complied and stumbled forward, watching as Aina and Enzo lifted Samuel to his feet. A dagger was held to his neck by one of them while the other held a shorter knife to his back. Samuel watched as I walked forward, only moving when pushed forward with the tips of the sharp blades. My head went to turn back to watch him, but Toye trained the gun on the back of it to prevent the movement. I choked back a sob as I felt the hardness push my hair aside and rest on the vulnerable skin of my skull. As we began walking, I tried to get my bearings. When it ran from the safe house, I didn't care which direction I went. When he'd run off the path, I didn't care either. It was only now, when I was tied up and being pushed forward by a gun, that I decided I should look around. And, of course, I didn't recognize a thing. However, I did know something. These people would only take us further into the forest, where we would likely be killed.